Hi everyone and welcome to the Wiley webinar series. I'm Finn, your host for today's session, which is titled Your Research Story, Creating Visualizations to Increase Your Research Impact. The session will be presented by Samantha Green, who is a Senior Content Marketing Manager at Wiley. Samantha creates resources for the research community to improve the impact of public research, and she is the executive producer of Wiley's science communication podcast, This Study Shows. Today's webinar is expected to last about an hour and will be recorded. The recording will be made available after the session has ended and a link will be emailed to you. As always, we welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to send through your questions anytime via the Ask a Question button, which is located underneath the main video player, and stay with us till the end for the Q&A session. Now I'll pass it over to Samantha.
Thank you, Finn. So hello everyone and a good evening to you from the US. So like Finn said, today I'm here to talk to you about data visualizations and how they can help tell the story of why your research matters. Now, I'm not a data scientist. I work in Wiley's marketing and communications team. And that means that for me, data visualizations are all about the why and the so what of your research. I'm also primarily going to be talking about data visualizations for a non-specialist audience. And by that, I mean we're talking about how to translate your research into visualizations for the public or for people outside of your field. I thought I would start us off with the basics. What is data visualization? It's not just turning your data into a chart or a graph. It's about using images, color, and other visual tools to communicate relationships among the data. An impactful data visualization brings together amazing design that makes it memorable for your audience, amazing data that makes it trustworthy for your audience, where they can guarantee accuracy. An impactful data visualization brings together a strong concept that makes it interesting for your audience, and a goal that makes it useful. And by goal, I really mean that a data visualization has a point of view. It has a perspective and something that it's trying to say, and oftentimes something that it's trying to get its audience to do. We think of data visualization as a way to answer a question. It's more than information, it's more than data, it's an answer to a problem, and form and function for data visualizations really have to go hand in hand. Visualizations make a viewer think about the meaning of the data. They encourage the eye to compare different pieces of data, to find relationships between this point and that point. In this image here, which I know is quite hard to read, but it's from the mid-1800s, so we'll give it a bit of a break. This is an example of an early information graphic, what we would refer to now as an infographic. And it was designed by somebody named Charles Joseph Menard, and it depicts Napoleonic France's invasion of Russia. So you can clearly see that multiple aspects of information are being depicted in one chart. Beginning on the left-hand side of the graphic, the army is large, and you can tell that by the width of this brown band. But as this army travels, the width of that bar shrinks, indicating the shrinking size of the army thanks to harsh weather conditions or disease. And you can also see offshoots of the army and their retreats depicted in black. And when the full army finally retreats, beginning in the far right-hand side of this graphic, you can see just how much the size of that army continues to shrink as they travel home to France. And when you compare the size of the army that left France for Russia and the size of the army that returned from Russia, on the left-hand side, the brown versus the black, this graphic makes the devastation of the invasion crystal clear in a way that numbers on their own could not. So the graphic helps us add meaning, and it helps us add weight to the data. Now, if there's anybody out there who is still questioning the value of data visualization, I wanted to share a few facts that hopefully help persuade you about how effective data visualization can be as a tool for communication. The human mind in general processes visuals much more quickly than it does text. We can process, listen, and understand visual information a kind of shocking 323% better than we can text alone. And furthermore, we remember images more. So when we think about this in the context of data visualization, this is already how we process the world. And if we, as researchers or as people creating data visualizations, want people to engage with our research, we need a visual way of telling that story. And furthermore, I think that data visualizations are a more accessible way to share research with audiences outside of academia or outside of your lab. Visuals are not bound by a language. While understanding data visualization is certainly a skill that needs to be developed, it's not one that is limited by what language someone speaks. And visuals in general aren't intimidating in the same way that a specialized research paper can be. Visualizations invite the viewer in, and they invite the viewer to explore the data and to figure out the meaning that you are trying to convey with the visualization. So understanding and processing visuals can be much more universal than text alone. Now, I first got into the world of data visualization from a storytelling perspective. Much like visualizations, stories are how we learn as humans. They are how we connect with other people, and often they're how we empathize with other people. We are around 7 times more likely to remember information if it's told to us in a story rather than as a series of disconnected facts. So, when we approach a data visualization as a miniature story we're trying to tell, it helps us to refocus on why we're designing a graphic. Data without a story just isn't going to be as impactful. Sometimes it feels like there's an infinite amount of data in the world, but more data isn't going to solve our problems. Instead, we need to find ways to communicate value from the data that we produce, especially for stakeholders outside of the research community who need to create action and decisions from that information. So storytelling in general gives data meaning. A good data storyteller begins with their audience and then thinks about the key message that they're trying to tell, what they want to achieve, what their audience cares about, and what the big idea is. They have to think about what the audience needs to know and what they need to do. And storytelling can make our research relevant and meaningful to that audience. And because we've used storytelling tools, they can empathize more with the people behind the data or the impact that the data might have on the lives of their neighbors or their communities. So take this visualization, for example. It's very simple and very US focused, which I apologize for. But the use of a dollar bill makes this data real and very tangible. It tells the story of the actual person earning this dollar. And I also use this example because I hope that it shows that you don't need any artistic ability in order to create a data visualization. So now that we've established some of the power of data visualization, I want to talk about some of the pitfalls and some of the things that need to be considered when both creating a data visualization and when viewing data visualizations. I think that one of the best ways to start to familiarize yourself with the world of data visualization and the possibilities of data visualization is really just to look at what's around and look at what is being produced elsewhere. But in order to do that, we have to be able to read charts with a critical eye. So the first thing to remember about charts and data visualizations is that because they are powerful tools for understanding and for memory, they can often be used out of context. I think that the best data visualizations reinforce a point or reflect a particular conclusion about the data, but that also leaves data visualization open to misuse and misinformation in a format that implicitly implies trust and accuracy to the viewer. Data, much like anything else, can be manipulated, and a non-specialized audience especially may be unprepared for discerning what is accurate and what is inaccurate. Much of the tools that we would use to tell whether something in a visualization is skewing your interpretation of the data as a viewer are things that you all in this audience will likely already be familiar with. But I think when it comes to a non-specialist audience or audiences who may not be as familiar with data visualizations, things can get missed and things can be kind of lost in translation. So this can include simple things like axes shouldn't be truncated to zoom in on minute differences between data points. If you're working with a 0% to 100% axis, that should be fully represented. Rainbow color maps can cause people to thematically lump together similar colors as statistically similar. So color palettes in general should reflect the range of values. That also goes for colors that are similar, like red and orange or blue and purple. A viewer will sort of pull those data points together in their mind because they are visually linked. Furthermore, 3D graphics can often skew understanding of data as we interpret the graphic through depth perception. So all of these sort of basic chart and graph do's and don'ts need to be considered when it comes to data visualization. And I think the best way to sort of ward against some of these pitfalls is really just to be aware of them. So we have to remember that much like literacy, what some scholars refer to as graphicacy is a skill that needs to be developed. It's not something that comes naturally or comes without critical thought. Data visualizations also require standards, much in the way a research article does, of course. It should never be questionable where you've sourced the information for your visualization. So everything should be clear where the data came from. And then lastly, bias. Again, data visualization tells a story, but that leaves it vulnerable to the bias of the point that you're trying to make. There's a scholar named Alberto Cairo, who I will mention again several times in this presentation. And he's the author of several books, including one called How Charts Lie, which goes into much greater depth of these pitfalls. So I think that if you're interested in improving not only your ability to create data visualizations, but also your ability to interpret data visualizations that you see on the internet or in the news, I highly recommend his website, thefunctionalart.com, which will be also linked at the end of my presentation, and goes through some of these bias and context issues in a much more granular fashion. I want to spend a few minutes focusing on the idea of context. I think a lot of times we can think of data visualization as something that removes the data from its wider context, from the larger data set, or from the research articles that you're pulling from to create this visualization. And it's kind of true. Data visualizations can't speak on their own. So what you see on the screen here is a data visualization that I've stripped all of the context from. I've removed most of the labels. I've removed the title of the chart. And as you can see, it is very confusing. It's sort of clear from the visuals themselves that we're probably talking about cities. We're maybe talking about the ocean, because you can see there's a tiny boat at the top of the graphic. But beyond that, this data visualization takes far too much detective work and is far too open to misinterpretation. And now, here's the chart with the labels added back in. So we can see that it's titled When Sea Levels Attack, and that there are labels for the different cities. So now we can kind of start to assume we're talking about rising sea levels and how long it will take for them to overtake the cities. But this chart still is not the most exciting. The font sizes are very small. There's a large and maybe even some zooming in and out to understand the full picture. You might not be able to see these data labels on the screen that you're viewing this on right now. So it still is not a chart that gives up its story easily. And now, in this zoomed in to one of the same chart, you see the detail. You can see that in 100 years' time, the sea level will have risen and Venice will be followed shortly thereafter by Amsterdam. Within 200 years, there goes Lower Manhattan, there goes San Francisco. The use of silhouettes and the gradient color of the ocean is much clearer at this smaller scale, but we're only looking at about a quarter of the overall graphic. And we've lost now, by zooming into this degree, a lot of the extra information that was included in the sidebar. So this chart can't speak on its own, and it probably needs a little bit of editing to be able to speak accessibly for audiences with different screen sizes and viewing it in different platforms. So we have talked about the importance of context, about the challenges of bias, and I'm sure that we've all seen data visualizations in the media that are confusing or downright inaccurate. And I want to take a second to remind everybody that data visualization as a skill and as a way of sharing news and information is in incredibly high demand, but it's often being created by people who are not necessarily data experts. And even if they are data experts, they might not have the time to give to every visualization they are tasked with. The journalists over at The Economist even maintain a running article that tracks original data visualizations and how they would improve them if given a second chance. So when researchers are involved in data visualization, I think they get better. They become more accurate, and I think that they have a better chance of conveying the real meaning of research to an audience. So now we're going to talk about and sort of transition into how to create charts with meaning. There is a wealth of information out there, but I've pulled together a few things that I think every data visualization needs to consider at the start, so that when you all kind of either begin on the path of creating data visualizations or refine your skills further, you have some tools to begin with. So my first tip, or my first tool, is about creating a visual that matches the subject matter of your data. If you can do this, it will immediately connect the subject matter with the insights for your viewer. And again, this doesn't require artistic skill, Stick figures will work, digital icons will work, photos will work, or you can find someone else with artistic skill to work with you on a data visualization. So imagine this chart here about caffeine content in various types of drinks, created by a data journalist named Mona Shalabi, as if it were a simple bar graph, as if these eyeballs were just bars that measure the number of milligrams of caffeine in each of these types of drinks. That wouldn't capture even a fraction of the emotion in this data visualization, or even a little bit of the impact of these eyes that become more and more alert with each milligram of caffeine. There's something very simple and very powerful about being able to tie what you are illustrating with the data that you are presenting. I have spent a lot of time talking to scientists about data visualization, and this point about simplification is always a tough one for us to wrap our heads around, which I understand. You spend years compiling a data set only to have to condense it down into a single graphic. So what I like to do is encourage thinking about data visualization as clarifying rather than simplifying. A data visualization is not meant to be a representation of all the data that you've collected. It's a representation of a particular story or a particular conclusion that you are trying to make. And that means removing everything that doesn't apply to that story. So take this graphic, which is, interestingly enough, about stories. This graphic tracks the various plots that appear in the winners of the Booker Prize over the years. And as you can see, though, in some respects, the level of detail and this whole illustration is very interesting to look at from an aesthetic perspective. When it comes to trying to draw a conclusion or to learn something from this visualization, it's just impossible. It's another one where the data labels are much too small to read. It's very hard to follow these kind of shift of lines in the middle. So with something like this, I might recommend focusing in on a particular plot line. So for example, instead of tracking all of the plot lines that appear in the winners of this prize over the years, you could create a graphic titled something like, if you want to win the Booker Prize, make sure your book has a plot about death in it. Because death is this black section on the right, so it's clear that the plot most correlated with winning includes some death. And doing that would focus in on relevant, interesting data, and it would tell a much more specific story, and a story that has a much stronger point of view than simply presenting all of this data in a way that's very inaccessible to read. Now, on top of the idea of clarification, it's super important, it's critical to design a data visualization for comprehension. You are creating a data visualization for a reason, and that is because you need someone somewhere to understand your data. We often start our data visualizations with research or with the data itself, but instead, if we start with the idea or the question or even the problem that we're trying to solve, we can shape that idea into our visualization. So these three charts here show different depictions of weather projections. And rather than starting with the idea that I need to share this data on an upcoming hurricane, we start with the idea of people need to be prepared if this upcoming hurricane is going to affect them. And from that idea of preparation and protection, we can build out a concept that focuses on a visualization showing the probability that people will be affected by this hurricane, when and how much. And if you know why you're making the data visualization, if you know that it is about the protection and the preparation of the people who might face this storm, it's much easier to know how you should design it and what data points need to be included. I think weather projections are a pretty perfect example of a time when people outside of the scientific or the research community need to understand data. How the public interprets a weather graphic might determine whether they make safe choices, or it might lead them to be ill-prepared for what comes next. These charts on this slide here are designed by Alberto Cairo, who is the Knight Chair in Science Journalism at the School of Communication in Miami. And he created these graphics to demonstrate this idea. So the first on the left is a typical hurricane projection. It is sort of cone of impact that shows the timeline of the hurricane's approach to land. But as we can see in the middle graphic, the cone itself is only 66% accurate, and the non-scientist audience is unaware of this. And that means that the people living on either side of this cone don't know that there's a 33% chance that they might experience the hurricane as well. So we redesign to the graphic on the right, which shows what our uncertain weather data truly means. You have that cone shape in the center, represented visually by stronger and darker cyclones. And you've also represented the 33% chance that the cone shifts east or west with lighter cyclones. So this helps people in the regions affected by the lower probability of being hit by this hurricane, helps them to understand that they might still be impacted and that they should probably either prepare or pay extra attention to the weather going forward. And this graphic on the right has the potential to save lives that the graphic on the left does not. And because of that type of potential for data visualizations, I think it's especially important to think about your intended audience for a graphic. Who are they? Who are you trying to get to understand your data? That information will affect the level of detail that you include, and you might focus your visualization on what you know that they care about. For example, a student looking at a data visualization, as it might look at it as a jumping off point for a new research project. So they'll need more data and they'll need room in your visualization to explore and ask their own questions inspired by what you've shared. Or if you are creating a data visualization to present to a government official, you might know that they are most interested in knowing the economic impact of, say, the deforestation that you're showing in your infographic, because that's what they know communities care about, and that's what they know they need to create laws for. They might not care about the ecological diversity of a forest, but instead they might be more likely to care about how much money the community loses by not protecting land, for example. You also need to consider what your audience already knows. How much context do they need to understand what you're sharing? And then you have to think about whether there's something you need your audience to do. I think we see countless examples of this right now around COVID-19, and there are many, many data visualizations out there that show the decreased chance of transmission if both parties are wearing a mask or are separated by distance. And then finally, this question about the Twitter feed. This is a bit of a tough one. How can your data visualization stand out on your intended audience's Twitter feed, or in their news scrolling, or in their already overfull email? And this last question here is kind of twofold, because social media is a great place to share a data visualization and to promote your research article through a data visualization. And social media is also probably where your intended audience is spending, honestly, too much of their time. So you have to think about colors that stand out. You have to think about a catchy title and think about making sure that your font sizes and the amount of information that you're including in your visualization is going to be accessible from a phone screen, because that's often where people are viewing. So as an additional small but important tool is labels. So we showed earlier in the example of when sea levels attack just how important labels are, but there's definitely such a thing as too many labels. And when you find you have too many labels, or your labels become cluttered, hard to read, hard to engage with, that probably is an indication that there's too much data in one visualization. As you can see in this example, with a truly ridiculous number of data points to label. So in general, the rule of thumb is to label the information that you visualize so that your audience can understand it, but to only visualize the data that you need to make your point and to tell your story. Color is also an important tool when it comes to contrast and when it comes to showing relationships between data. When you're talking about multiple tones of the same color, that will automatically connect the data in the mind of your audience. But as we can see in this top example, too many colors can get confusing or muddy for viewers. So using a single highlight color for the most important data can help it to stand out, as you can see in the top right example. And when it comes to contrast, especially when you have text on color, there needs to be a high enough ratio of difference between your background color and your text color so that it's accessible for viewers, as you can see in sort of the contrast ratio chart of this bottom section here. And then lastly, when it comes to color, in general, you want to use light colors or pale colors for low values and dark colors for high values, because that will also help your data to be understood more intuitively by your audience. And a final point of color while we're on the subject is it's always helpful to consider color blindness when making your color selections. When you contrast red with green, for example, that can make your chart muddy and hard to read for people with red-green color blindness. And this graphic here on the left kind of represents what that looks like for people who can see the full color spectrum, and then for people who have various types of color blindness. But contrasting yellows, oranges, and blues, on the other hand, will still be clear no matter how your audience sees color. And there are online resources that can help you to evaluate the accessibility of your color palette and sort of check that before you share your data visualization. My final tip to you all is a simple one, and that's to have your data visualizations peer reviewed. Show it to a few people who are not in your field, who are not specialists in your discipline. And if they have questions or if they have trouble understanding, keep redesigning until what you have created is clear to everybody. And this process will also help you refine your practice and improve your ability to create and edit data visualizations. There are sort of countless tools to be able to create data visualizations online. I've listed out a few here, but there are many, many more, especially if you are somebody who can get into coding and into developing different kinds of scripts for the web. So these tools here are free to use and are pretty accessible to everybody. Tableau Public is a particular favorite of mine, and Infogram is great for creating visualizations, especially for non-specialized audiences. But if you remember some of the illustrations that I've included in this presentation, especially Mona Shalabi's illustrations with the dollar bills or the overly caffeinated eyeballs, there's really no limit to the creativity that you can bring to data visualization. I think that this is a real opportunity to get a little bit creative and to take a few risks, and you never know what's going to work until you try it out and until you experiment. So with that, thank you all so much for your time. I also wanted to leave you with a couple of resources that I've used over the years as I've gotten more interested and more involved in data visualizations, as well as the links to a couple of people who I think are doing really amazing work in this space to just sort of see what's out there and what is particularly interesting. And if you aren't sure where to start, I think scrolling through Alberto Cairo's blog, The Functional Art, is a great way to do it because he focuses on good and bad data visualizations and how to improve them. And it's a great place to be inspired. So thank you again, and I believe that that opens us up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. That was great. We've got time for a couple of questions. We've actually had this one a lot. Is there any software that you'd recommend that can help data visualization?
Yeah, so I think the primary one that I would recommend is Tableau Public. There is no coding required. It does, I believe, require a download, but I would recommend this one for a few different reasons. As I said, there's no coding required, but you also gain access to a community of visualizers, and you can see their work and you can talk to them. Tableau Public also has a lot of learning resources, and it's really easy to import and export your data and to play around with different types of visualizations and different ways of presenting your data. So that would probably be my top recommendation for a free service. They have a paid for service, of course, as well, but their free service is pretty wonderful.
Great. Another question we've had is, would some journals not accept articles with colorful visualizations or graphics like you've been talking about? Is that something people need to concern themselves with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that depending on the journal and depending on, you know, the ultimate format of the published article, whether it's print or whether it's digital, that will often play into whether you can use color. I also think that the data visualizations that I've been describing or that we've been talking about today are not necessarily the ones that go into the published research article. I think that they can, but I also think that they can be an extra tool that you use to promote your research or to kind of get it out for a wider audience. So I think don't let whether or not a journal accepts color graphics as a reason to hold off on exploring data visualizations. There's a whole community for them and a whole
Yeah, great. Another question we've had, how can you prevent misuse or misinterpretation of data visualizations?
That's a great question. That's a very big question and a very tough one to answer. I think in terms of what you can do as somebody creating a data visualization, I think it kind of goes back to those fundamentals of making sure that everything is clearly labeled, your sources are clearly either linked through your visualization if the format allows it, or your sources are listed right there in the visualization so that it's harder to disconnect the source of your data from the visualization of your data. And I also think that there's so much out there in terms of data and in terms of data visualization, and it's really easy, especially in something like social media, for data to be shared and shared again and shared again and slowly removed of its original context. So I think doing whatever you can to be very clear about the origin of the data and the scope of the data in the visualization itself goes a long way. I also think that there's a lot of room, so I don't mean to keep returning to Alberto Cairo, although I think he's a wonderful resource for this type of thinking and this type of work. But I think there's a lot of room for researchers and for the research community in general to speak up and point out when there are things that are inaccurate or misleading in a data visualization. This is probably not something that you will have created yourself, but if somebody uses your data to create a visualization that draws an incorrect conclusion or is inaccurate, I think that we as a research community need to feel empowered to correct those inaccuracies and to point them out when we see them.
Yeah, great point. We've probably got time for one final question. How do you balance using these visuals versus traditional written text? When is it necessary to have text explaining your visuals, or is that sort of more dependent on the work itself?
I think it's dependent on the visual and on the topic. I think that especially for a lot of the topics that we create visualizations about, especially if they are very much based in a particular discipline or in a particular body of research, are going to be complex and are going to be complicated, and that will require some context and some clarification. I think what's key to the balance is making sure that anything that you write around the visualization, especially if it's going on a blog or on social media, is written still for the audience that you've created the visualization for. So making sure that there's no jargon included, that wherever possible you've used terminology and language that is accessible to the audience that you're trying to reach, and making sure that you're still only contextualizing the visualization itself rather than the full body of research, so that it remains contained and it remains something that can stand on its own is important. But the amount of text and the level of complexity that you need to kind of contextualize is certainly going to depend on the data visualization and kind of the topic of the graphic itself.
Yeah, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Samantha, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
No, just to say thank you, and my email address is in the slides as well, so please feel free to contact me with any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
Yeah, great. Thank you again, Samantha, for taking the time, and a big thank you to our audience for joining as well. As I said at the start, the slides will be sent to you in an email, and I hope you found the session useful, and I'll see you at our next webinar.